What would you pay for immortality? Not the promise of it, not some vague spiritual concept, but actual, physical immortality that you could hold in your hands, feel against your skin, take with you into the afterlife. For thousands of years, the Chinese had an answer to that question, and it wasn't gold. It was jade, a stone so precious that emperors were buried in suits made entirely of it, sewn together with gold thread. A material so valued that a single piece could ransom a city, start wars, and determine the fate of kingdoms. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the ancient Chinese believed jade was worth more than all the gold in their treasuries, why they thought it could prevent their bodies from decaying after death, and why this green stone became the physical embodiment of every virtue they held sacred. Because this isn't just a story about a pretty rock. This is about how an entire civilization's deepest beliefs about mortality, morality, and the cosmos itself became crystallized in a mineral harder than steel and more treasured than any metal on Earth. Let's start with something that seems impossible to modern minds. The ancient Chinese genuinely believed jade could make you immortal. Not symbolically immortal, not remembered through history immortal, but physically never decay immortal. They called jade the essence of heaven and earth, believing it was formed when the cosmic forces of yin and yang achieved perfect balance in the depths of the mountains. This wasn't superstition to them. This was natural philosophy, as rational and evidence-based as any modern scientific theory, built on thousands of years of observation and tradition. And the evidence, from their perspective, was compelling. Jade was eternal. It didn't rust like iron, didn't tarnish like silver, didn't corrupt like bronze. You could bury it in the ground for 1,000 years and dig it up looking exactly the same. If jade itself was immune to decay, impervious to time, then surely it could transfer that property to whatever it touched. Surely it could preserve a human body the same way it preserved itself. This belief drove the Chinese to do something absolutely extraordinary. They created jade burial suits. Imagine a full-body suit of armor, but instead of protecting you in battle, it's designed to protect you in death. These suits were made of thousands of small jade plaques, each one carefully cut, polished, and drilled, then sewn together with gold, silver, or bronze thread, depending on the deceased's rank. The most famous example is the jade suit of Prince Liu Sheng, discovered in 1968, made of 2,498 pieces of jade, connected with 1,100 grams of gold wire. It took the craftsman who made it an estimated 10 years to complete. 10 years of labor, mountains of the most precious materials in China, all for a single burial. That's not excess. That's not vanity. That's absolute, unshakable conviction that this stone could bridge the gap between life and death. But here's what makes jade even more fascinating than gold. Gold was valuable because it was rare and beautiful. Jade was valuable because it represented something far more important than wealth. It represented moral perfection. The ancient Chinese saw in jade's physical properties a perfect metaphor for human virtue. Confucius himself, the philosopher whose ideas would dominate Chinese thought for 2,000 years, wrote extensively about jade. He identified 11 virtues in the stone. Its luster represented benevolence. Its translucency represented honesty. Its sonorous quality when struck represented wisdom. Its hardness represented courage. Its sharp edges that didn't cut represented righteousness. This wasn't poetry. This was philosophy made physical. When a Chinese gentleman wore jade, he wasn't displaying wealth. He was displaying his commitment to living a virtuous life. And this created something that Western minds struggle to understand. A luxury good that you couldn't just buy your way into owning. Sure, you needed wealth to acquire jade, but wealth alone wasn't enough. If you were known as a corrupt official, a dishonest merchant, a cruel warlord, wearing fine jade didn't make you look rich. It made you look like a hypocrite. It was like wearing a priest's robes while everyone knew you ran a brothel. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. This meant that jade had a regulatory function that gold never could. Gold just meant you were rich. Jade meant you were supposed to be good. And if you wore jade while being visibly, obviously not good, society would judge you for it in ways that went far beyond envy. This moral dimension of jade created some of the most famous stories in Chinese history. The most celebrated is the tale of Bian He, a man who found a piece of raw jade so perfect it would become legendary. He brought it to the king of Chu, claiming it was the finest jade ever discovered. The king's jewelers, looking at the rough, unpolished stone, declared it worthless and accused Bian He of trying to deceive the monarch. As punishment, they cut off his left foot. Years later, with a new king on the throne, Bian, he tried again. The new jewelers made the same assessment. They cut off his right foot. Finally, with a third king ruling, Bian, he sat at the base of a mountain, holding his stone, weeping. When the king heard about this man crying over a rock, he sent someone to investigate. "Are you crying because you lost your feet?" the messenger asked. "No," Bian He replied. "I'm crying because a precious jade is called a stone, and a faithful man is called a deceiver." That's not all. The third king, moved by this response, ordered the stone cut open. Inside was jade of such extraordinary quality that it became known as the Heishi Bi, the jade disc of He, one of the most treasured objects in all of Chinese history. It eventually became the imperial seal of China, passed down through dynasties, fought over in wars, lost and found again across centuries. But here's the crucial detail. Bian, he didn't weep because he lost his feet. He wept because truth wasn't recognized, because virtue wasn't valued, because the real and the fake had been confused. That story encapsulates everything jade meant to the Chinese. It was never about the money. It was about what was real, what was true, what was worth more than your own body. This philosophical weight that jade carried made it function differently in the economy than gold. Gold was universal currency. You could trade it, melt it down, use it anywhere. Jade was personal, specific, weighted with meaning that changed based on who owned it, where it came from, what it had witnessed. A piece of jade that had been owned by a famous scholar was worth more than an identical piece owned by no one important. A jade disc that had been used in imperial ceremonies for generations was priceless, while a new jade disc of the same size and quality was merely expensive. Jade accumulated history, absorbed significance, became more valuable the longer it existed, and the more important the hands it passed through. This made jade the perfect vehicle for aristocratic culture, because you couldn't just acquire jade wealth in one generation. You inherited it, accumulated it over centuries, built collections that told the story of your family's virtue and importance across time. The most important ritual use of jade reveals just how deeply the stone was embedded in Chinese cosmology. The Chinese believed the universe had a specific shape and structure, and jade objects were created to represent and interact with that structure. A flat jade disc with a hole in the center, called a bai, represented heaven. A square jade tube with a circular bore, called a kong, represented earth. These weren't decorative objects. They were tools for communication with the cosmos. When emperors performed sacrifices to heaven and earth, they used jade bai and kong to make the connection, to ensure their prayers would be heard, to maintain the harmony between the human realm and the celestial. This usage was so important that archaeologists have found bai discs in graves dating back 7,000 years, long before Chinese civilization as we know it existed. Jade wasn't just important to China, it was foundational, present from the very beginning, shaping religious and philosophical thought from the Neolithic period forward. But let's return to that comparison with gold, because it's where the real divergence between Chinese and Western values becomes visible. In most ancient civilizations, gold was the ultimate standard of value, because it was rare, didn't corrode, was easily divisible, and was universally desired. These are perfect characteristics for money, but they're terrible characteristics for a moral exemplar. You can't cut virtue into pieces and divide it among people. You can't melt down righteousness and recast it into a new form. The very qualities that made gold perfect for commerce made it unsuitable for representing transcendent values. Jade, on the other hand, was impossible to work with. It's one of the hardest stones in existence, harder than steel, able to scratch almost anything. Before modern tools, The only way to carve jade was with abrasives, slowly grinding away at the stone grain by grain, a process so time-consuming that complex jade carvings could take years to complete. This difficulty wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The fact that jade was almost impossible to work with meant that creating something from jade required exactly the virtues that jade represented: patience, perseverance, precision, long-term thinking, resistance to shortcuts. A jade carver couldn't get frustrated and rush the work. The stone would simply break. They couldn't cut corners to finish faster. The flaws would be permanent. They had to embody the virtues of jade in order to work the jade itself. This created a self-reinforcing loop where the material and the morality it represented became inseparable. Compare this to gold, where a skilled craftsman could create beautiful work relatively quickly, where mistakes could be melted down and fixed, where the material itself forgave error and rewarded speed. Gold was democratic in its workability. Jade was aristocratic, demanding, unforgiving. The Chinese love of jade also shaped their relationship with the natural world in ways that gold never could. Jade had to be found, and finding jade was a spiritual as much as a practical endeavor. The best jade came from the rivers of Xinjiang in China's far west, where jade boulders worn smooth by water could be found in riverbeds. Jade hunters would search for years, learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicated jade versus ordinary stone, developing an almost mystical connection with the material. There are stories of jade hunters who could identify jade by moonlight, by the way water flowed around it, by intuition that bordered on the supernatural. This wasn't mining in the industrial sense. This was more like a pilgrimage, a quest where the worthy would be rewarded and the unworthy would find only stones. And once you found jade, you had to make a crucial decision. What would you make from it? Because unlike gold, which could be melted and reformed endlessly, jade could only be shaped once. Every cut was permanent. Every design decision was irreversible. This meant that creating a jade object required you to envision the final form before you began, to understand the stone's natural characteristics, to work with the material rather than imposing your will upon it. The best jade carvers were those who could see the object already existing within the rough stone and simply reveal it, cutting away only what was necessary, preserving as much of the natural jade as possible. This philosophy of working with nature rather than dominating it, of revealing inherent qualities rather than imposing external form, became fundamental to Chinese aesthetics in ways that influenced poetry, painting, garden design, and philosophy itself. No one could have expected what came next in jade's history. During the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, jade's association with immortality reached its absolute peak. The Emperor Wu of Han became obsessed with achieving physical immortality, and jade played a central role in his quest. He consumed jade powder mixed with dew water, believing it would purify his body and extend his life. He wore jade amulets constantly, thinking they would protect him from disease and decay. And when he died, despite all his precautions, his obsession with jade reached its logical conclusion. He was buried in a complete jade suit, every inch of his body covered in the imperishable stone, sewn together with gold thread, in a tomb filled with jade objects meant to preserve him for eternity. It didn't work, of course. His body decayed just like any other, but the belief persisted, because the alternative was too terrible to accept. This was just the beginning, because the failure of jade to actually prevent decay didn't diminish its value. If anything, it increased it. When later emperors opened ancient tombs and found the jade perfectly preserved while the bodies had turned to dust, they didn't conclude that jade had failed. They concluded that the bodies hadn't had enough jade, or the right kind of jade, or that the burial rituals hadn't been performed correctly. This is the power of belief when it's deeply embedded in culture. Contrary evidence doesn't disprove the belief, it just shows that the belief wasn't properly applied. And so the demand for jade continued, and prices rose, and the stone became more precious with each passing dynasty, not despite its failure to deliver immortality, but because that failure only proved how rare and special true immortality was, how much more jade would be needed to achieve it. But there's something else that made jade more precious than gold. Something we haven't touched on yet. Jade could tell stories that gold never could. A gold coin from one dynasty looks essentially like a gold coin from any other dynasty. Gold is gold, valuable precisely because it's uniform, standardized, interchangeable. But every piece of jade is unique. The color varies from pure white to deep green, to brown, to nearly black, depending on the minerals present in the stone. The translucency changes, the texture shifts, the internal structure creates patterns that are never repeated. This meant that jade objects were recognizable, memorable, individual in ways that gold objects weren't. When the historical records mention a specific jade disc, we can sometimes identify the exact object they're describing, even thousands of years later, because its unique characteristics were recorded and preserved. Try doing that with gold. This uniqueness made jade perfect for another function that gold could never serve, as proof of identity and authority. The imperial jade seal, carved from the Heishi bee that Bian, he had discovered at the cost of his feet, became the ultimate symbol of legitimate rule in China. Whoever possessed the seal was the legitimate emperor, not whoever had the most gold, not whoever commanded the largest army, not whoever had the noble bloodline, but whoever held that specific piece of jade. This led to some of the most dramatic moments in Chinese history, as the seal was fought over, stolen, hidden, recovered, lost again across 15 centuries. At one point, it fell into a well and took months to recover. At another, it was held hostage by a warlord who demanded half the empire in exchange for it. And eventually, it was lost forever, disappearing sometime in the chaos of the late Tang dynasty, never to be seen again. But that's not all. The loss of the imperial jade seal created a crisis of legitimacy that persisted for centuries. Later dynasties had to create new seals, but they could never quite replicate the authority of the original. Because the point wasn't just to have a jade seal, it was to have that specific jade seal, the one with its unique history, the one that had been held by emperors for 1,000 years, the one that Bian He had wept over, that had been carved from jade so perfect it was worth a man's feet. No amount of gold could replicate that. No new jade, no matter how perfect, could carry that weight of history. This is the fundamental difference between jade and gold. Gold was valuable because of what it was. Jade was valuable because of what it meant. This distinction became even more important in Chinese diplomacy. When China wanted to establish relationships with neighboring kingdoms, they didn't send gold, they sent jade. A jade gift from the Chinese emperor was not a payment, not a bribe, not even really a gift in the Western sense. It was an acknowledgement of virtue, a recognition that the recipient was worthy of jade, that they embodied the qualities that jade represented. Accepting jade meant accepting Chinese cultural values, joining a civilization that measured worth in moral rather than purely economic terms. This is why Chinese tributary relationships worked so differently from Western colonial relationships. The West sent gold and took resources. China sent jade and took deference. The West built empires on economic exploitation. China built spheres of influence on cultural prestige. And the tributary kingdoms understood this perfectly. They would send their own jade objects back to China, not as payment, but as proof of their own virtue, their own worthiness to participate in this civilization. The most skilled artisans in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan learned to work jade in the Chinese style, creating objects that would impress Chinese court officials, that would demonstrate their mastery of Chinese aesthetic and moral principles. This created a feedback loop, where jade became the physical currency of a cultural empire, more powerful than military conquest because it was voluntary, more lasting than economic dominance because it shaped how people thought about value itself. But let's talk about what happened when this system encountered Western trade. When Portuguese merchants first arrived in China in the 16th century, they were confused by Chinese attitudes toward gold and jade. From a European perspective, gold was obviously more valuable. It was rare, it was universally accepted, it could be weighed and standardized. Jade was just a pretty rock with no inherent value beyond what people assigned to it. The Portuguese tried to trade gold for jade, expecting to make a fortune buying cheap stones and selling them for gold prices. The Chinese were equally confused. Why would they trade jade, which represented virtue and immortality and cosmic harmony, for gold, which was just metal? Useful, certainly, but fundamentally inert, morally neutral, philosophically void. This mutual incomprehension reveals something profound about how different civilizations construct value. The European system was based on scarcity and utility. Gold was valuable because it was rare and useful for coinage and trade. Jade was less valuable because it was just decorative. But the Chinese system was based on meaning and virtue. Jade was valuable because it meant something important. Gold was less valuable because it was just shiny. Neither system was wrong, but they were incommensurable, unable to be translated into each other's terms without losing something essential. A Chinese scholar wearing jade wasn't making an economic statement, he was making a moral one. A European merchant wearing gold wasn't making a moral statement, he was making an economic one. And when these two systems collided, neither side could quite understand what the other valued or why. This clash of values had real consequences. As European influence in China grew, as Western economic systems became more dominant, as modern banking and international trade standardized gold as the universal measure of value, jade's importance began to decline. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, inexorably. By the 20th century, wearing jade had become more about tradition than conviction, more about cultural identity than philosophical belief. The wealthy still bought jade, but they also bought diamonds, platinum, Western luxury goods. Jade became one precious stone among many, rather than the precious stone that defined all others. Yet here's what's remarkable. Jade never completely lost its special status in Chinese culture. Even today, even in thoroughly modern China, jade carries meanings that diamonds and gold don't. When a Chinese mother gives her daughter a jade bangle, she's not just giving jewelry, she's passing down protection, virtue, family continuity. When a businessman wears a jade pendant, he's signaling not just wealth, but also connection to tradition, moral seriousness, cultural authenticity. The old beliefs about jade's power to preserve and protect are still there, muted perhaps, rationalized away, but not completely abandoned. Because some values run so deep that they survive even when the worldview that created them has changed. The archaeological evidence of jade's importance is staggering. In 1976, archaeologists opened the tomb of Fu Hao, a military general and queen from the Shang dynasty who lived over 3,000 years ago. Inside, they found 755 jade objects, not 755 pieces of gold, though there was gold in the tomb. 755 jade objects, each one carefully carved, each one representing hours or days or weeks of skilled labor. This wasn't unusual. This was normal for a high-status burial in ancient China. The sheer quantity of jade in these tombs, the incredible skill required to create it, the resources devoted to acquiring and working it, all testify to a value system where jade wasn't just expensive, it was essential. And the techniques used to work jade were themselves evidence of jade's supreme importance. Before modern tools, carving jade required sand, water, and time. Enormous amounts of time. A jade worker would use a bow drill with abrasive sand to slowly, grain by grain, cut into the stone. To create the hole in a jade bai disc might take weeks. To carve a detailed jade dragon might take months or years. The finest jade pieces, the ones in imperial collections, represented literally human lifetimes of work. When you understand this, when you grasp how much human time and effort went into a single jade object, the price begins to make sense. A gold object could be cast in days. A comparable jade object might take a decade. In a very real sense, jade wasn't more valuable than gold. It was more valuable than time itself. This is why jade forgeries were so serious in ancient China. If you forged gold, you were a counterfeiter, a criminal, deserving punishment. But if you forged jade, if you tried to pass off common stone as genuine jade, if you carved quickly and carelessly and tried to sell your work as if it embodied the virtues that jade represented, you weren't just a thief. You were a moral corrupter, someone trying to make society believe that virtue and vice looked the same, that the fake and the real were indistinguishable. The punishment for jade forgery was often more severe than for gold forgery, not because jade was economically more valuable, but because the crime was philosophically more serious. Let me tell you about one more thing that jade could do that gold couldn't. It could sound. When you strike a piece of jade, if it's genuine, if it's high quality, it rings. A pure, clear, resonant tone that can last for seconds. Ancient Chinese musicians created jade chimes, instruments made of carefully tuned jade pieces that produced music unlike anything else in the world. These weren't just musical instruments, they were cosmic instruments meant to produce sounds that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of the universe, that brought the human realm into harmony with the celestial. Gold can't do this. Strike gold and it thuds, dull and dead. But jade sings. This sonic quality of jade became another way to authenticate it, another property that linked it to cosmic perfection. The best jade workers developed such refined hearing that they could identify jade quality by sound alone, could hear in the ring of struck jade whether it was flawed, where the flaws were, how it should be carved to avoid them. This was more than skill. It was an almost supernatural sensitivity, developed through decades of listening to stones sing, learning their language, understanding their nature. And this knowledge couldn't be written down, couldn't be taught from books, could only be passed from master to apprentice through years of apprenticeship, creating lineages of jade workers whose knowledge was itself more precious than gold. The philosophy behind jade's value is perhaps best expressed in the concept of the gentleman's jade. In Confucian thought, the ideal man, the junzi or gentleman, should be like jade. Beautiful but not showy, hard but not brittle, valuable but not common, natural but refined. This wasn't a metaphor suggesting gentlemen were similar to jade. It was a statement of moral ontology. Gentlemen and jade shared the same essential nature, embodied the same virtues, existed in the same relationship to the cosmic order. To wear jade was to aspire to these qualities, to publicly commit yourself to embodying them, to invite judgment based on how well you lived up to the stone you wore. This created enormous social pressure. If you were wealthy enough to afford jade but your behavior was corrupt, people didn't think, what a shame that corrupt person has nice jade. They thought, what a hypocrite, claiming jade's virtues while living jade's opposite. The jade itself became an accusation, a constant reminder of your moral failures. This is why some Chinese officials, when they knew they were about to be arrested for corruption, would remove their jade first. Not because the jade would be confiscated, all their property would be confiscated, but because being arrested while wearing jade was adding hypocrisy to their crimes, making their fall from grace even more complete. Now compare this to gold. Gold has no moral dimension. A corrupt official wearing gold is just a corrupt official who happens to be rich. The gold doesn't judge him. Society might judge him for his corruption, but the gold is neutral, uninvolved. This moral neutrality is precisely what makes gold perfect for commerce and terrible for character building. You can't shame someone into virtue by pointing at their gold, but you could shame them by pointing at their jade, because wearing jade was making a claim about who you were. And if that claim was false, the jade itself became evidence of your dishonesty. Let's address one final aspect of why jade was more precious than gold: its role in medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine held that jade, when worn against the skin, could regulate bodily humors, calm the mind, extend life, and prevent disease. Jade pillows were believed to cool hot thoughts and improve sleep. Jade rollers used on the face were thought to preserve youth and beauty. Jade powder consumed in small quantities was believed to strengthen bones and purify blood. Now, from a modern medical perspective, none of this works. Jade has no pharmacological properties. But here's the thing: the belief that it worked was itself therapeutically valuable. If you believed jade would make you healthier, you took better care of your jade, kept it clean, wore it consistently. This created rituals of self-care, moments of mindfulness, daily practices that, independent of the jade itself, probably did improve health and longevity. The placebo effect is real, and jade was perhaps the most powerful placebo in Chinese culture. Gold had no such medical associations. You didn't wear gold to improve your health. You wore it to display wealth. And wealth, while nice, doesn't make you feel morally better, doesn't create daily rituals of virtue, doesn't give you a framework for self-improvement. Jade did all of these things. This made jade valuable in ways that transcended economics, that touched on psychology, identity, meaning, purpose, all the things humans actually need but can't buy with mere money. So here we are, at the end of this journey through jade and gold, through Chinese values and Western values, through beliefs about mortality and morality and what makes life worth living. And what have we learned? We've learned that jade was more precious than gold in ancient China, not because it was rarer or more beautiful or more useful, but because it meant more. It represented immortality, virtue, cosmic harmony, truth, tradition, continuity, identity. It was hard to find, harder to work, impossible to fake convincingly. It accumulated history, told stories, carried meanings that changed based on who owned it and why. It couldn't be melted down and reformed. It couldn't be standardized or commodified completely. It resisted the very processes that made gold perfect for commerce. And perhaps most importantly, jade demanded something from its owner that gold never did. It demanded that you live up to it. Gold just demanded that you had money. Jade demanded that you had character. Gold was passive, inert, morally neutral. Jade was active, judging, demanding. This made jade more expensive in every sense. More expensive to acquire, more expensive to work, more expensive to wear properly, because wearing jade meant accepting responsibility for representing the virtues it embodied. When we ask why jade was more precious than gold, we're really asking what Chinese civilization valued above all else. And the answer is clear. They valued meaning over money, virtue over wealth, the spiritual over the material, the eternal over the temporary. They built an entire value system around a stone that was almost impossible to work, that couldn't be used as currency, that had no practical function beyond beauty and symbolism. And they sustained that value system for thousands of years, through dynasties and invasions and cultural changes, because jade represented something that gold never could. The possibility that human virtue could be as eternal, as beautiful, as imperishable as the stone itself. That's why jade was worth more than gold. Not because the economics made sense, but because the values did. And in understanding this, we understand something crucial about the difference between price and worth, between what things cost and what they mean, between the temporary exchange value that markets create and the permanent cultural value that civilizations build. Jade teaches us that the most precious things aren't always the most useful, aren't always the most rare, aren't always the most easily quantified. Sometimes the most precious things are those that remind us who we aspire to be, that hold us accountable to our highest ideals, that connect us to traditions larger and older than ourselves. That was Jade's gift to China. And that's why, even after thousands of years, even in our modern world of standardized currencies and global markets, jade still holds a special place in Chinese hearts. Not as an investment, not as mere jewelry, but as a reminder of what their ancestors believed was truly worth more than gold: the eternal, the virtuous, the imperishably beautiful.